July 18, 1966. The monsoon rains had transformed the clearings around Tam Kai into pools of mud and blood. The air reeked of aviation fuel and crushed jungle foliage. The rhythmic thump of UH-1 Huey rotors carved through the early evening like steel blades, vibrating deep into the chest cavity of every man within miles. Across South Vietnam's Ecor tactical zone, the sound had become as familiar as breathing, and just as essential for staying alive. Inside the cramped cockpit of Dustoff 73, Chief Warrant Officer John Wilbanks adjusted his flight helmet with methodical precision. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from ground units scattered across the Quang Nam province. Artillery impacts echoed like distant thunder through the humid air. Wilbanks checked his instruments one final time, his weathered hands moving across switches and gauges with the unconscious efficiency of a man who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. The UH-1D medical evacuation helicopter, designated Dustoff in honor of the radio call sign that had become legendary among American forces, represented the thin line between life and death for wounded soldiers throughout Southeast Asia. These aircraft carried no weapon, bore prominent red crosses on their olive-drab fuselage, and operated under the protection of international medical conventions that enemy forces routinely ignored. Their crews flew into hostile landing zones with nothing but skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to a simple principle: leave no one behind. Below the orbiting Huey, 23 Marines from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, found themselves surrounded in a bomb crater-scarred clearing designated Landing Zone Echo. The patrol had been ambushed during a routine sweep-and-clear operation 3 miles southwest of Tam Kai, caught in a carefully orchestrated crossfire involving at least 2 companies of North Vietnamese Army regulars equipped with Soviet-supplied DSHK heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The monsoon season had arrived with biblical fury, dumping nearly 6 inches of rain in the previous 48 hours. The deluge transformed the red clay soil into a treacherous quagmire that swallowed vehicles and made movement nearly impossible. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in many areas, while the constant moisture corroded equipment and created perfect breeding conditions for tropical diseases that claimed more American lives than combat in some months. Radio communications from Landing Zone Echo painted a grim picture. 3 Marines lay critically wounded, bleeding into the muddy water that pooled in their defensive positions. Company Commander Captain Michael Thompson had taken shrapnel in both legs and was losing blood at an alarming rate. Lance Corporal Robert Martinez, barely 19 years old, had suffered a through-and-through gunshot wound to the abdomen that required immediate surgical intervention. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class David Chen, himself wounded by mortar fragments, continued treating his comrades while enemy fire intensified around their perimeter. The tactical situation deteriorated by the minute. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies had been exhausted hours earlier. The surrounding jungle concealed an unknown number of enemy fighters who seemed content to wait for darkness before launching their final assault. Without immediate evacuation, the wounded Marines faced certain death, either from their injuries or from the inevitable overrun that would come with nightfall. At the forward operating base in Pleiku, 50 miles to the northwest, military planners studied aerial photographs and radio intercepts with growing concern. The weather forecast promised continued heavy rain through the night, with cloud ceilings dropping below safe flying minimums for helicopter operation. Intelligence reports suggested significant enemy troop movements in the area, including possible deployment of portable surface-to-air missiles recently supplied by North Vietnamese allies. Captain Richard Hayes, commanding officer of the 57th Medical Detachment, reviewed the mission parameters with clinical detachment. Years of experience had taught him to weigh tactical risks against potential gains with mathematical precision. The proposed landing zone sat in a natural bowl surrounded by heavily forested hills that provided ideal firing positions for enemy gunners. Approach routes were limited and predictable. The weather made precision flying nearly impossible. Most damning of all, radio intercepts indicated the presence of at least one 12.7mm anti-aircraft gun, positioned to cover the likely helicopter approach corridors. Hayes made his decision with the cold logic of command responsibility. "No helicopter will survive landing in that clearing," he announced to the assembled flight crew. "We'll send the Dustoffs at first light tomorrow, when we can provide proper artillery preparation and gunship support." The pronouncement fell over the briefing room like a death sentence. Seasoned pilots and crew chiefs exchanged knowing glances. They had all lost friends to similar calculation, measured risks that proved tragically miscalculated when real human lives hung in the balance. But Hayes commanded the unit, and his word carried the weight of military law. Chief Warrant Officer John Wilbanks sat in the back row, methodically cleaning his survival knife while listening to the tactical assessment. At 34 years old, he already bore the distinctive weathered appearance of veteran helicopter pilots who had spent too many hours battling tropical heat, mechanical failures, and enemy fire. His uniform bore the faded wings and cross insignia of the Dustoff community, earned through hundreds of combat missions and thousands of hours spent threading needle-eye landing zones under impossible conditions. Wilbanks had enlisted in the Army 8 years earlier, drawn by recruitment promises of technical training and adventure. He possessed natural flying instincts that instructors at Fort Rucker recognized immediately. His training records showed consistently high marks in instrument flying, emergency procedures, and tactical navigation. More importantly, he demonstrated the indefinable quality that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones: the ability to make split-second decisions under extreme stress while maintaining absolute focus on mission accomplishment. The Dustoff mission had claimed him completely from his first day in Vietnam. Unlike combat pilots who delivered destruction from altitude, medical evacuation crews dealt intimately with war's human cost. They landed where others feared to venture, carrying hope into the darkest corners of the battlefield. The wounded soldiers they rescued were not abstract tactical objectives, but real people with names, families, and dreams interrupted by violence. This personal connection created bonds that transcended normal military relationships. Wilbanks understood the mathematical logic behind Captain Hayes's decision to delay the rescue mission until dawn. Weather conditions made night flying extremely hazardous. Enemy anti-aircraft capabilities in the area were well documented. A rational risk assessment clearly indicated that attempting immediate evacuation would likely result in additional casualties without significantly improving outcomes for the surrounded Marines. But mathematics could not account for certain human factors that experienced combat veterans understood instinctively. Wounded soldiers lying in mud and darkness did not calculate survival probability. They simply fought to stay alive one breath at a time. Their comrades defending the perimeter drew strength from knowing that help would come, regardless of obstacle. The Dustoff mission represented more than medical evacuation. It embodied an unbreakable covenant between American forces that no sacrifice was too great to honor. As the briefing concluded and personnel began filing out of the operations center, Wilbanks remained seated, lost in thought. The radio continued transmitting periodic updates from Landing Zone Echo. Each transmission sounded weaker than the last, punctuated by background noise of gunfire and explosions. Between official status reports, desperate personal messages leaked through the static, requests for family notification, final letters dictated to surviving comrades, quiet prayers offered in multiple languages by young men facing mortality far from home. The monsoon rain drummed steadily against the corrugated metal roof of the operations building. Outside, technicians worked frantically to maintain aircraft readiness, despite the crushing humidity that corroded equipment and degraded performance. The air smelled of high-octane aviation gasoline, hydraulic fluid, and the distinctive odor of tropical decay that permeated everything in Southeast Asia during the wet season. Wilbanks made his decision with characteristic directness. Rising from his chair, he walked quietly from the briefing room toward the flight line, where Dustoff 73 waited under harsh floodlights. His crew chief, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, was performing routine maintenance checks when Wilbanks approached the aircraft. Rodriguez had arrived in Vietnam 3 months earlier, a 22-year-old helicopter mechanic with impressive technical credentials and no combat experience. He possessed encyclopedic knowledge of UH-1 system and could diagnose mechanical problems that baffled more experienced technicians. But his real education had come through observing Wilbanks during actual missions, learning how theoretical engineering principles translated into life-and-death decisions of fire. "Pre-flight complete, sir," Rodriguez reported, wiping grease from his hands with a stained rag. "All systems check normal, except the number 2 navigation radio is intermittent. Probably moisture in the antenna connections." Wilbanks nodded absently while studying weather reports posted on the aircraft status board. Wind speeds were variable, but manageable. Visibility remained marginal, but within acceptable limits for experienced pilots. Cloud ceilings hovered near minimum operational requirements. None of these factors presented insurmountable obstacles for someone with his flying experience and intimate knowledge of local terrain features. The UH-1D Iroquois helicopter, universally known as the Huey after its original HU-1 designation, represented the technological backbone of American air mobility doctrine in Vietnam. Bell Helicopter had designed the aircraft around the compact T-53 turboshaft engine that provided unprecedented reliability and power-to-weight ratio compared to earlier piston-powered designs. The result was a versatile platform capable of rapid troop insertion, cargo transport, command and control, and medical evacuation across the full spectrum of combat operations. Medical evacuation variants carried specialized equipment that transformed the basic transport helicopter into a flying emergency room. Litter systems could accommodate up to 6 wounded soldiers lying flat or 9 sitting casualties. Oxygen systems provided respiratory support during transport. Medical supply compartments contained trauma equipment, intravenous solutions, and emergency medication. Most importantly, these aircraft carried trained medical personnel capable of performing life-saving procedures while airborne. The Dustoff mission had evolved through hard experience since the first American advisors arrived in South Vietnam during the early 1960s. Initial medical evacuation procedures followed conventional doctrine developed during World War II and Korea, emphasizing careful coordination with ground force and extensive preparation of secure landing zones. But the unconventional nature of conflict in Southeast Asia, with its fluid battle lines, unpredictable enemy contact, and emphasis on small unit operations, demanded tactical innovations that challenged traditional approaches. Dustoff crews learned to operate independently, making immediate tactical decisions based on limited information while maintaining direct radio contact with wounded soldiers. They developed techniques for landing in impossibly small clearings surrounded by hostile forces, using speed and surprise to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Most importantly, they established reputation for absolute reliability that became legendary among ground forces throughout South Vietnam. This reputation carried enormous psychological significance that extended far beyond simple medical capabilities. Soldiers facing enemy contact knew with absolute certainty that help would come when needed, regardless of tactical circumstances or weather conditions. This knowledge provided immeasurable morale benefits that contributed directly to combat effectiveness. Conversely, any failure to respond when wounded soldiers required evacuation would undermine confidence throughout the force and potentially affect mission performance in future operations. Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks understood these dynamics through hundreds of previous missions flown under similar circumstances. He had landed in landing zones that seemed impossible to reach, extracted wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire, and navigated through mountain valleys in weather conditions that grounded other aircraft. His reputation within the Dustoff community reflected not just exceptional flying skill, but absolute commitment to mission accomplishment, regardless of personal risk. The radio transmission from Landing Zone Echo came through with crystalline clarity at precisely 21:47 hours. Dustoff, this is Bravo 6 actual. We have immediate priority wounded requiring evacuation. Landing zone is hot. Repeat, landing zone is hot. How copy? Wilbanks keyed his microphone without hesitation. Bravo 6, this is Dustoff 7-3. I copy your transmission. What is your current tactical situation? The response carried undertones of desperation, barely masked by professional military terminology. Dustoff 7-3, we are taking effective fire from multiple positions. 3 urgent surgical cases, 1 priority. Unable to move to alternate pickup site. Request immediate extraction or these Marines will not survive until morning. Captain Hayes monitored the radio conversation from the operations center with growing concern. Standing orders required his personal authorization for any Dustoff mission launched under current weather and tactical conditions. The request clearly exceeded established risk parameters. Enemy activity in the area remained high. Weather conditions continued deteriorating. Most importantly, losing a medical evacuation helicopter and crew would eliminate his unit's capability to respond to future emergency situations throughout the entire operational area. But Hayes also recognized the impossible position facing commanders at every level throughout Vietnam. Military doctrine emphasized proportional response and calculated risk management. Combat realities demanded immediate action based on incomplete information and uncertain outcome. The gap between theoretical planning and battlefield execution had consumed countless careers and claimed thousands of lives since American involvement began escalating in 1962. Wilbanks contacted the operations center for official mission authorization, knowing the request would be denied. Base operations. This is Dustoff 7-3, requesting immediate launch authority for emergency medical evacuation mission grid coordinates, Bravo 647218. The response came through official channels with predictable bureaucratic precision. Dustoff 7-3, negative on launch authority. Weather conditions and enemy activity exceed acceptable risk parameter for night medical evacuation operation. Mission will be reconsidered at first light with appropriate tacticals. The notification represented sound military decision-making based on established protocols and careful risk assessment. Captain Hayes had considered multiple factors, including aircraft availability, crew readiness, weather conditions, enemy capabilities, and potential consequences of mission failure. His decision reflected conventional military wisdom, accumulated through decades of combat experience in multiple conflicts. But conventional wisdom could not account for the human equation that drove individual soldiers to extraordinary acts of courage under impossible circumstances. Throughout military history, exceptional leaders had distinguished themselves not through strict adherence to established procedures, but through willingness to accept personal responsibility for decisions that transcended normal tactical calculations. Wilbanks considered his options while studying approach routes on tactical maps spread across the operations table. Standard procedure required him to accept the mission denial and await authorization for morning operations with full tactical support. Violation of direct orders would result in court-martial proceedings and probable end of his military. More importantly, unsuccessful mission execution would cost lives of his crew members who trusted his judgment and flying abilities. Against these considerations stood a more fundamental obligation that defined the Dustoff community. Wounded soldiers had called for help, and help would come. The specific tactical circumstances, command authorization, and personal consequences were secondary to this primary commitment. Every Dustoff pilot understood that mission failure meant wounded Americans would die waiting for assistance that never arrived. Wilbanks made his decision with quiet certainty that surprised no one who knew him well. Rodriguez, start pre-flight procedures. We're going flying. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had served with enough combat pilots to recognize the tone that indicated discussion was over. Roger, sir. Pre-flight in progress. The UH-1D medical evacuation helicopter carried minimal defensive armament, 2 M60 machine guns mounted in door positions that provided limited protection against ground fire, but were primarily intended for suppressive fire during landing and takeoff procedures. The aircraft's primary protection came from speed, maneuverability, and pilot skill, rather than weapons system. This philosophy reflected the medical evacuation mission's reliance on international conventions regarding protection of clearly marked medical aircraft. Enemy forces in Vietnam had demonstrated routine disregard for such conventions, treating medical helicopters as priority targets because of their psychological and tactical importance to American operations. Dustoff crews learned to approach landing zones with extreme caution, using terrain masking and unpredictable flight paths to minimize exposure to ground fire. They developed techniques for rapid patient loading that reduced time on the ground to absolute minimum. Weather conditions remained problematic, but not impossible for an experienced pilot with intimate knowledge of local terrain features. The monsoon rain reduced visibility and created dangerous wind shears that could force helicopters into uncontrolled descents. Low cloud ceilings limited altitude options and forced crews to fly dangerously close to treetops and mountainsides. Standing water in potential landing zones created uncertainty about ground conditions that could result in catastrophic crashes during landing. Wilbanks had accumulated over 800 combat flight hours in similar conditions throughout his Vietnam tour. He possessed detailed mental maps of terrain features, enemy positions, and safe approach routes throughout his operational area. Most importantly, he had developed pilot skills that allowed precise aircraft control under marginal weather conditions that grounded less experienced aviators. The flight from Pleiku to Landing Zone Echo covered approximately 53 miles of mostly hostile territory, controlled by regular North Vietnamese Army units and Viet Cong guerrilla forces. Navigation would require dead reckoning techniques, supplemented by periodic radio beacon fixes, as weather conditions prevented use of visual landmark or celestial navigation methods. Flight time would be approximately 25 minutes each direction, assuming no complications from enemy fire or mechanical problem. Dustoff 73 lifted off from Pleiku at 203 hours without official authorization or tactical support. Wilbanks maintained radio silence to prevent interception of flight plans by enemy forces, known to monitor American communications frequency. The helicopter climbed steadily through layers of monsoon clouds, while Rodriguez monitored engine parameters and navigation system. The flight progressed normally until reaching coordinates approximately 10 miles from the objective area. At that point, radio transmissions from Marines defending landing zone Echo indicated their situation had deteriorated significantly. Enemy forces had moved closer to the perimeter under cover of darkness and heavy rain. Ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. 2 of the wounded soldiers had lost consciousness and required immediate surgical intervention to survive. Most ominously, the ground commander reported hearing tracked vehicles moving through the jungle, an indication that North Vietnamese forces were preparing to commit armored units for their final assault. American forces in the landing zone had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping even lightly armored vehicles. Their defensive position would be rapidly overrun once enemy tanks entered the engagement area. Wilbanks acknowledged the transmission and continued inbound while considering tactical options. The original plan called for a rapid approach from the northwest, taking advantage of a small valley that provided some concealment until the final approach to the landing zone. This route would minimize exposure to known anti-aircraft positions, but required flying through the most concentrated area of enemy ground forces. Alternative approach routes offered better protection from small arms fire, but would bring the helicopter directly over documented heavy machine gun positions. The southeastern approach provided better weather protection, but required flying over a ridgeline that enemy forces had been observed using for mortar positions. Each option involved significant risks that could result in aircraft loss and crew casualty. The decision required balancing multiple competing factors: crew safety, mission success probability, weather conditions, enemy capabilities, and time constraints imposed by the deteriorating condition of wounded Marines. Wilbanks possessed extensive combat experience that provided intuitive understanding of such tactical calculations, but ultimately, his choice reflected personal values that defined his approach to military service. Radio contact with the ground unit came through with unusual clarity as Dustoff 73 approached the final waypoint before beginning approach procedures. Dustoff 73, this is Bravo 6 actual. Situation critical. Enemy forces massing for final assault. Estimate 15 minutes before position is overrun. Can you make immediate pickup? The transmission carried undertones that required no interpretation. Wounded Marines were dying. Their comrades had exhausted ammunition and medical supplies. Without immediate evacuation, the entire unit would be lost, along with the helicopter crew attempting to rescue them. The mission had evolved into a race against time with life-or-death consequences for everyone involved. Wilbanks keyed his microphone for what he knew might be his final radio transmission. Bravo 6, this is Dustoff 73. Understand your situation. We are inbound for pickup. Mark your position with whatever you have available. The response came immediately. Dustoff 73, marking with red smoke. Be advised, landing zone is under direct fire. We will provide suppressive fire during your approach. Red smoke began rising from the jungle canopy, approximately 2 miles ahead, visible even through the heavy rain and low cloud cover. The signal marker indicated the precise location of wounded Marines, but also revealed the landing zone to enemy forces who certainly observed the distinctive color and understood its significance. Tactical surprise had been sacrificed for navigation accuracy, a trade-off that increased risks for everyone involved. Wilbanks began his approach descent through layers of monsoon clouds, maintaining precise control of the helicopter despite gusty winds and reduced visibility. Rodriguez monitored communication frequencies while scanning the jungle for muzzle flashes or other indications of enemy position. The door gunners charged their M60 machine gun and prepared for immediate engagement once the landing zone became visible. The first indication of enemy contact came as tracers began rising from multiple positions around the landing zone perimeter. Green tracers from AK-47 assault rifles mixed with the heavier red tracers from Soviet-supplied machine guns, creating deadly light show against the dark jungle canopy. The concentration of incoming fire indicated that enemy forces had anticipated the medical evacuation attempt and positioned multiple weapons systems to ensure aircraft destruction. Wilbanks maintained his approach despite the obvious threat, using every technique learned through hundreds of previous combat missions. He varied altitude and airspeed randomly to prevent enemy gunners from predicting aircraft position. He used terrain masking whenever possible, keeping ridgelines between the helicopter and known enemy position. Most importantly, he suppressed natural survival instincts and continued flying directly toward concentrated enemy fire because wounded Marines depended on his courage and skill. The UH-1D shuddered as multiple rounds penetrated the fuselage and cabin area. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as hydraulic fluid and engine oil began leaking from damaged components. The distinctive smell of aviation fuel filled the cabin, indicating potential fire hazard that could consume the aircraft within seconds, but the helicopter remained controllable, and the mission continued. Landing Zone Echo emerged from the jungle mist as a small clearing roughly 50 meters in diameter, surrounded by dense vegetation that provided perfect concealment for enemy forces. The red smoke marker rose from a bomb crater in the center of the clearing, where Marines had established their defensive positions. Wounded soldiers lay on improvised stretchers made from ponchos and rifle slings, protected by comrades who continued firing at unseen enemies despite dwindling ammunition supply. Wilbanks flared the helicopter for landing, while Rodriguez and the door gunners engaged enemy positions with sustained machine gun. The aircraft touched down in a controlled crash as landing gear sank deep into the muddy soil. Marines immediately began moving wounded comrades toward the helicopter while maintaining defensive fire against enemy forces, who increased their rate of fire in desperate attempts to prevent successful evacuation. The loading process took approximately 45 seconds, an eternity under combat conditions, but remarkably fast considering the circumstances. 3 critically wounded Marines were loaded onto medical litters, while a 4th soldier with less severe injuries sat in the crew chief's position. Hospital corpsman Chen, despite his own wounds, continued treating patients while the helicopter prepared for takeoff. Enemy fire intensified as engine RPM increased for departure. Multiple rounds struck the aircraft's fuel tanks and transmission system, causing additional warning lights and abnormal instrument readings. Most critically, hydraulic pressure dropped below minimum requirements for normal flight control, forcing Wilbanks to maintain aircraft control through physical strength and flying experience rather than powered system. The overloaded UH-1D struggled to achieve translational lift in the humid air and marginal weather conditions. Enemy tracers followed the ascending helicopter as Wilbanks fought to gain altitude and airspeed while maintaining control of the badly damaged aircraft. For several terrifying seconds, the outcome remained uncertain as the helicopter barely cleared treetops while trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, but flying skill and mechanical reliability prevailed over enemy fire and adverse conditions. Dustoff 73 achieved stable flight and began the return journey to Pleiku with 4 wounded Marines. Medical treatment began immediately as Hospital Corpsman Chen and one of the door gunners administered intravenous fluids and emergency medications while monitoring vital signs. The helicopter's cabin became a flying emergency room where traumatic injuries received initial treatment that would determine survival out. However, radio transmissions from Landing Zone Echo revealed that the evacuation mission remained incomplete. One Marine, Lance Corporal Tommy Harrison, 19 years old and serving his first combat tour, remained in the defensive position with wounds too severe to allow movement during the initial pickup. His condition had deteriorated during the helicopter loading process, rendering him unable to walk or assist with his own evacuation. Marine ground forces reported that Harrison had lost consciousness and required immediate medical intervention to survive. His wounds included multiple shrapnel injuries from mortar impact and a through-and-through rifle upper torso that had punctured his left lung. Without surgical treatment within the next hour, he would certainly die in the jungle, where so many other young Americans had paid the ultimate price for geopolitical objectives they barely understood. The tactical situation had also worsened during the evacuation attempt. Enemy forces had used the helicopter's approach as an opportunity to advance their positions closer to the Marine perimeter. Tracked vehicles could now be heard moving through the jungle at distances estimated under 500 meters. Artillery preparation fires had been requested, but could not be delivered due to weather conditions that prevented accurate target acquisition. Most significantly, the Marines defending Harrison's position reported that their ammunition was nearly exhausted. They possessed perhaps 50 rounds of rifle ammunition and 2 grenades between 5 soldiers. Their radio batteries were failing, making communication increasingly difficult. Without resupply or immediate evacuation, the entire unit would be overrun within minutes of the next enemy assault. Captain Hayes monitored radio transmissions from Pleiku with growing alarm as reports painted an increasingly desperate picture. His careful risk calculations had assumed that a single helicopter could evacuate all wounded personnel in one trip. The reality of combat operations had proven this assumption incorrect, creating a situation where additional missions were required under even more dangerous circumstances than originally assessed. Standard military procedure under such conditions called for careful recalculation of risk factors and development of alternative plans that provided better probability of mission success. This process typically required several hours of planning and coordination with adjacent units, artillery support, and tactical air assets. Unfortunately, Lance Corporal Harrison did not possess several hours of remaining life expectancy. Wilbanks landed at Pleiku with his aircraft trailing smoke and leaking multiple fluids onto the flight line. Maintenance personnel immediately began damage assessment, while medical personnel transferred wounded Marines to the base hospital. Initial examination revealed extensive battle damage that would require several hours of repair work before the helicopter could safely return to combat operations. But Dustoff 74, an identical UH-1D medical evacuation helicopter maintained as a backup aircraft, sat ready for immediate deployment on an adjacent parking. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had already begun pre-flight procedures when Wilbanks approached the aircraft after delivering his casualties to the medical facility. The crew chief understood without discussion that their mission remained complete. Captain Hayes intercepted Wilbanks before he could board the backup aircraft. The commanding officer's position required him to balance competing obligations: mission accomplishment, force preservation, and adherence to established procedures. Allowing a second unauthorized flight would compound the original violation of direct orders and potentially result in additional casualties without significantly improving outcomes for the remaining Marine. Chief Wilbanks, Hayes said with official formality, I am specifically ordering you not to launch another mission tonight. Weather and tactical conditions exceed acceptable risk parameters. We will coordinate proper support and attempt extraction at first light. Wilbanks understood his commanding officer's position and respected the logic behind the order. Military organizations require discipline and adherence to established procedures to function effectively under combat conditions. Individual initiative, regardless of good intentions, could lead to chaos and unnecessary casualties if allowed to override command authority. But he also understood the immediate reality facing Lance Corporal Harrison and the Marines protecting. First light was approximately 7 hours away. Harrison's medical condition would not permit survival through the night without surgical intervention. The Marines defending his position lacked ammunition to repel another enemy assault. Waiting for official approval and tactical support would ensure that American soldiers died while bureaucratic processes unfolded. Sir, Wilbanks replied with quiet respect, I understand your order, but there's still a Marine out there who's counting on us. The exchange reflected fundamental tensions that had shaped military operations throughout American history. Individual courage had won battles when official caution might have resulted in defeat. Conversely, unauthorized actions had sometimes led to disasters that could have been prevented through careful planning and proper coordination. Success or failure often depended on factors that could not be predicted or controlled through established procedures. Hayes made his decision based on military regulations and command responsibility. Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks, you are specifically ordered to remain on the ground. That is a direct order. Do you understand? Wilbanks acknowledged the order and walked away from the operations center. But instead of returning to his quarters, he continued toward the flight line where Dustoff 74 waited under the harsh illumination of floodlights. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had completed pre-flight procedures and was waiting for further instructions. The decision required Wilbanks to choose between military obedience and personal conscience. Violation of direct orders during combat operations constituted a serious offense that would result in court-martial proceedings and probable imprisonment. His military career, built over 8 years of dedicated service, would end in disgrace. His family would suffer the financial and social consequences of his decision. Against these personal costs stood the life of a 19-year-old Marine who had volunteered to serve his country in a dangerous foreign war. Harrison had trusted that American forces would not abandon wounded soldiers regardless of tactical circumstances. His comrades continued risking their own lives to protect him based on fundamental military values that transcended individual survival. Wilbanks made his choice with the same quiet certainty that had characterized his decision to launch the first unauthorized mission. Military regulations existed to serve military objectives, not the reverse. When regulations conflicted with fundamental military values, exceptional circumstances required exceptional responses. Rodriguez, he said, while climbing into the pilot's seat, start her up. The crew chief understood the implications of the order. Participating in a second unauthorized flight would end his military career, just as certainly as it would Wilbanks. But Rodriguez had also served long enough to understand that some decisions transcended personal consequences. He engaged the starter and began engine start procedures without hesitation or comment. Dustoff 74 lifted off from Pleiku at 23:41 hours without radio contact with base operations or authorization from higher headquarters. Wilbanks maintained communications silence during the outbound flight to prevent intervention by command authorities, who might order the mission terminated before reaching the objective area. The helicopter disappeared into the monsoon darkness, carrying 2 men who had chosen conscience over career security. The flight to landing zone Echo progressed normally until reaching the final approach waypoint. Radio transmissions from the remaining Marines indicated that their situation had deteriorated beyond critical levels. Enemy forces had launched their final assault approximately 20 minutes earlier. Artillery impacts were falling inside the defensive perimeter. Small arms fire could be heard in the background of radio transmissions, sometimes drowning out voice communications entirely. Most ominously, radio contact had become sporadic as Marine radio batteries failed and personnel became casualties. The last clear transmission reported that Lance Corporal Harrison remained unconscious, but alive. 3 Marines continued defending the position with improvised weapons, including knives and entrenching tools, after exhausting their ammunition. They had requested immediate evacuation or artillery fire on their own position to prevent capture. Wilbanks began his approach knowing that landing zone Echo was probably already under enemy control. The tactical situation had evolved well beyond the parameters of a normal medical evacuation mission. Attempting to land would likely result in aircraft destruction and crew capture or death. Continuing the mission violated every principle of risk management and tactical common sense. But military history was shaped by individuals who chose to exceed normal expectations when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses. Such decisions could not be justified through rational analysis or tactical calculations. They reflected personal values that transcended institutional procedures and individual survival instinct. The landing zone approached through sheets of monsoon rain and patches of low-hanging clouds that reduced visibility to near zero. Enemy muzzle flashes provided the only illumination in the jungle darkness, creating a strobing light show that revealed multiple weapon positions around the clearing perimeter. The concentration of fire had increased significantly since the earlier evacuation, indicating that enemy forces had committed additional resources to ensure mission failure. Wilbanks descended through the hostile fire with the same methodical precision he had demonstrated on hundreds of previous combat missions. He varied his approach angle and airspeed to prevent enemy gunners from predicting aircraft movement. He used terrain masking to minimize exposure time while maintaining sufficient altitude to clear obstacles. Most importantly, he suppressed natural survival instinct and continued flying directly toward concentrated enemy fire. The UH-1D absorbed multiple hits during the approach descent, as enemy forces concentrated their fire on the medical evacuation helicopter. Tracer rounds punctured fuel tanks and hydraulic systems, causing immediate loss of essential aircraft fluids. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel as various systems failed or operated outside normal parameters. The distinctive odor of burning electrical equipment filled the cabin as damaged wiring began smoldering. But the helicopter remained controllable as Wilbanks flared for landing in the small clearing where Lance Corporal Harrison waited with his remaining protectors. The landing was harder than normal as damaged hydraulic systems prevented fine control adjustments. Landing gear sank deep into the muddy soil while rotor wash scattered equipment and debris across the battle-scarred area. What Wilbanks discovered upon landing exceeded even his worst expectations. Lance Corporal Harrison lay unconscious near the remains of a shattered tree, protected by 2 Marines who had exhausted their ammunition and were fighting enemy forces with bayonets and entrenching tools. Enemy soldiers were advancing across the clearing from multiple directions, firing as they moved toward the helicopter and remaining defenders. The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of successful extraction. Enemy forces surrounded the landing zone and possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The helicopter was taking concentrated fire from positions that would prevent successful takeoff. Most critically, Harrison's medical condition had worsened to the point where moving him might cause fatal complications. But Wilbanks had not flown through hostile fire and violated direct orders to abandon his mission when success seemed impossible. He shut down the helicopter's engines and climbed from the pilot's seat with his survival weapon, a .38 caliber revolver that provided minimal protection against enemy forces, armed with automatic rifles and machine guns. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez followed his pilot's lead, grabbing an M16 rifle from the aircraft's emergency equipment. The 2 Americans joined the Marines defending Harrison's position, adding their weapons to a hopeless fight against overwhelming odds. They had chosen to share whatever fate awaited the soldiers they had come to rescue. The final battle lasted approximately 20 minutes. Though time became meaningless under such extreme circumstances, American defenders fought with desperate courage against enemy forces that pressed forward, despite taking casualties from accurate rifle fire. Hand-to-hand combat developed as ammunition ran out, and enemy soldiers reached the defensive positions. Lance Corporal Harrison regained consciousness briefly during the fighting, long enough to understand that Americans had risked everything to attempt his rescue. He died holding the hand of Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks, who had kept his promise to return, despite impossible odds and direct orders to the contrary. The enemy assault overwhelmed remaining defenders shortly before dawn. When Marine reinforcements reached Landing Zone Echo 3 days later, they discovered the wreckage of Dustoff 74, surrounded by evidence of fierce fighting. 5 American bodies lay near the destroyed helicopter, proof that medical evacuation crews had chosen death over abandonment of wounded comrades. Investigation of the incident revealed that Wilbanks had violated direct orders from his commanding officer and launched unauthorized missions that resulted in aircraft destruction and crew deaths. Military regulations clearly prohibited such actions, regardless of humanitarian motivations. From a purely disciplinary perspective, his conduct warranted court-martial proceeding and severe punishment. But investigation also revealed that Wilbanks had successfully evacuated 3 critically wounded Marines who survived their injuries and eventually returned to duty. His unauthorized actions had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. More importantly, his decision to return for Lance Corporal Harrison had demonstrated the unwavering commitment that defined the Dustoff community throughout the Vietnam. Captain Hayes faced the difficult task of writing official reports that balanced regulatory compliance with recognition of exceptional courage. His evaluation noted violations of direct orders, while acknowledging that Wilbanks had acted according to the highest traditions of military service. Subsequent investigations concluded that individual initiative had been inappropriate but understandable given combat circumstances. The incident became legendary within the medical evacuation community, though official recognition was limited due to the regulatory violations involved. Dustoff crews throughout Vietnam cited Wilbanks' example when justifying their own decisions to exceed normal risk parameters for wounded soldiers. His actions reinforced cultural values that elevated mission accomplishment over personal survival and unit cohesion over individual advancement. Years later, veterans who had served with Dustoff units in Vietnam described a mission philosophy that transcended normal military calculations. They spoke of wounded soldiers who represented more than tactical objectives. They were brothers whose survival justified any sacrifice. This philosophy produced casualty rates among aircrew personnel that exceeded infantry units, while generating survival rates among wounded soldiers that exceeded previous conflict. The broader implications of Wilbanks' decision reflected tensions between institutional requirements and individual conscience that have shaped military operations throughout history. Successful military organizations require discipline and adherence to established procedures, but exceptional circumstances sometimes demand exceptional responses that violate normal protocols in service of higher values. Modern military doctrine attempts to balance these competing requirements through mission-type orders that provide subordinate commanders with maximum flexibility within defined parameters. This approach recognizes that tactical situations often develop too rapidly for detailed centralized control while maintaining overall command authority and strategic coherence. But such doctrinal solutions cannot eliminate fundamental moral dilemmas that arise when regulations conflict with conscience. Individual soldiers must sometimes choose between institutional loyalty and personal values, knowing that either choice carries significant consequences. Military history suggests that organizations benefit more from individuals who choose conscience over convenience, even when such choices challenge established procedures. The Vietnam War produced numerous examples of individual initiative that exceeded official authorization while serving broader military objectives. Helicopter pilots routinely violated flight restrictions to evacuate wounded soldiers from hostile areas. Infantry commanders frequently exceeded engagement parameters to protect their units from enemy contact. Intelligence personnel sometimes acted on incomplete information to prevent anticipated attacks. These actions reflected cultural values within American military forces that emphasized mission accomplishment and unit cohesion over strict regulatory compliance. Such values developed through shared combat experiences that demonstrated the inadequacy of peacetime procedures for wartime realities. They created informal codes of conduct that sometimes conflicted with formal military regulations. Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks embodied these cultural values in his decisions to launch unauthorized medical evacuation missions, despite direct orders and obvious personal risks. His actions demonstrated commitment to fundamental military principles that transcended institutional procedures. Leave no one behind, accomplish the mission, care for your soldiers. These principles had guided American military forces through previous conflicts and would continue shaping military decisions long after Vietnam ended. The aircraft he flew, UH-1 Iroquois helicopters designated for medical evacuation, represented technological capabilities that enabled such personal decisions to have strategic implications. Previous conflicts had limited individual initiative to local tactical impact, but helicopter technology provided small units with unprecedented mobility and firepower that amplified individual decisions across entire operational areas. Dustoff missions throughout Vietnam demonstrated how technological capabilities could transform military operations when combined with cultural values that emphasized aggressive mission accomplishment. Medical evacuation helicopters saved thousands of American lives because their crews possessed both technical skills and moral commitment required for success under impossible circumstances. The engineering principles that enabled such missions reflected decades of aeronautical development focused on reliability, maintainability, and operational flexibility. UH-1 helicopters incorporated turbofan engines that provided consistent power output across wide temperature and altitude ranges. Modular component designs allowed rapid repair and maintenance under field conditions. Control systems provided precise aircraft handling that enabled precision flying under combat stress. But technological capabilities alone could not account for the success of medical evacuation operations during Vietnam. Aircraft systems required skilled operators who understood both mechanical functions and tactical applications. More importantly, they required individuals willing to risk their lives for abstract principles that seemed increasingly irrelevant as the war progressed without clear political objectives or measurable progress. The monsoon weather that complicated Wilbanks' final mission represented environmental challenges that affected all military operations throughout Southeast Asia. Seasonal rains reduced visibility, degraded equipment performance, and created hazardous flying conditions that grounded aircraft for extended periods. High humidity corroded metallic components and promoted fungal growth that damaged electrical systems. These environmental factors forced military commanders to balance mission requirements against equipment limitations that peacetime training had not adequately addressed. Helicopter crews learned to operate effectively under conditions that exceeded aircraft design parameters and pilot training standards. Their success required improvisation and risk-taking that challenged conventional operational procedures. Weather conditions during July 1966 were particularly challenging due to unusually heavy monsoon activity that produced record rainfall throughout South Vietnam's central provinces. Military operations were significantly restricted as rivers flooded, roads became impassable, and aircraft operations were limited to emergency missions only. These conditions created tactical opportunities for enemy forces while limiting American mobility and firepower advantages. The specific meteorological conditions during Wilbanks' missions included low cloud ceilings that forced helicopters to fly dangerously close to terrain features and enemy positions. Visibility restrictions prevented use of normal navigation techniques and complicated identification of landing zones and enemy positions. High winds created turbulence that made precise aircraft control difficult, while increasing fuel consumption and reducing payload capacity. Such environmental challenges required pilots to develop skills and techniques that exceeded standard training programs. They learned to navigate using dead reckoning methods, supplemented by radio beacon fixes and terrain recognition. They practiced precision flying under marginal visibility conditions that demanded complete integration of instrument flying with visual references. Most importantly, they learned to make rapid tactical decisions based on limited information and uncertain weather conditions. The tactical situation surrounding Landing Zone Echo reflected broader strategic challenges that characterized American military involvement throughout Vietnam. Small unit operations in remote areas required air mobility support that exceeded available resources, while enemy forces adapted counter-tactics specifically designed to neutralize American technological advantages. North Vietnamese army forces had learned to concentrate anti-aircraft weapons around likely helicopter landing, creating defensive zones that forced American crews to accept heavy losses or abandon evacuation missions. They timed attacks to coincide with weather conditions that limited American close air support while providing concealment for their own troop movements. Most significantly, enemy forces understood the psychological importance of medical evacuation to American military effectiveness. Successful interdiction of Dustoff missions would demoralize friendly forces while demonstrating enemy capability to challenge American technological superiority. This tactical approach transformed routine medical evacuation into high-stakes battle that determined broader military outcomes. The strategic implications of individual tactical decisions became increasingly apparent as the Vietnam War progressed, without clear political objective or measurable progress toward conflict resolution. Small unit actions like Wilbanks's unauthorized missions carried symbolic importance that exceeded their immediate military consequence. They demonstrated American commitment to values that transcended tactical considerations, while revealing contradictions between stated objectives and operational realities. Military historians have analyzed the Vietnam War extensively to understand how tactical successes failed to produce strategic victory, despite overwhelming American advantages in technology, training, and resources. Individual heroism and technical proficiency at the tactical level could not compensate for political and strategic failures that undermined military effectiveness and national support for continued involvement. But tactical actions also preserved essential military values that would shape future conflicts long after Vietnam ended. The Dustoff mission established precedents for medical evacuation that continue influencing military doctrine and operational procedures. More importantly, it demonstrated cultural values within American military forces that emphasize individual responsibility for collective success. The memorial at Fort Rucker, Alabama, where Dustoff pilots receive training today, includes Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks' name among hundreds of medical evacuation personnel killed during Vietnam combat operations. The memorial serves as a reminder that military effectiveness depends ultimately on individuals willing to risk everything for abstract principles that define military professionalism. Current medical evacuation doctrine incorporates lessons learned from Vietnam operations while addressing new challenges presented by contemporary conflict. Modern helicopters possess improved survivability features, including armor protection, electronic countermeasures, and redundant flight systems. Communication technology provides real-time coordination with medical facilities and tactical commanders, but fundamental challenges remain unchanged from those facing Wilbanks during his final mission. Medical evacuation crews still face decisions requiring individual initiative beyond normal procedure. They still encounter tactical situations where regulations conflict with mission requirements. Most importantly, they still depend on personal values that transcend institutional procedures when circumstances demand extraordinary responses. The aerospace technology that enables modern military operations continues evolving through development programs focused on unmanned systems, advanced materials, and integrated sensors. Future medical evacuation might incorporate robotic systems that reduce crew exposure while providing enhanced medical capabilities during transport. Communication systems might provide direct medical consultation between battlefield medics and hospital specialists. But technological advancement cannot eliminate human factors that determine military success under extreme circumstances. Individual courage, moral commitment, and tactical judgment remain essential elements that no mechanical system can replicate. Future military effectiveness will continue depending on individuals willing to accept personal responsibility for mission accomplishment, regardless of institutional procedures or personal consequences. The rain has long since stopped falling over the jungle clearings where young Americans fought and died for principles they barely understood. Landing Zone Echo has been reclaimed by tropical vegetation that erases evidence of desperate battles fought over terrain that possess no strategic value beyond the lives it claimed. The monsoon cycles continue their eternal rhythm, indifferent to human conflicts and political objectives, but the memory persists among those who served and those who study military history for lessons that transcend specific conflict. Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks' decision to violate direct orders represents individual moral courage that defines military professionalism at its highest level. His sacrifice demonstrated values that connect contemporary military forces to historical traditions extending back through centuries of American military experience. Lance Corporal Harrison's death in a remote jungle clearing represents the ultimate cost of military service. Young lives sacrificed for national objectives that often seem abstract until individual soldiers are asked to pay the price. His sacrifice demonstrates the trust that that soldiers place in military institutions and national leadership when they volunteer to serve in dangerous foreign conflict. The broader lessons from their story extend beyond military applications to fundamental questions about moral responsibility in complex organizations. When do individual conscience and institutional procedures conflict? How should individuals respond when regulations seem inadequate for extraordinary circumstances? What obligations do organizations have to support individuals who exceed normal requirements in service of institutional value? These questions remain relevant for military leaders, corporate executives, government officials, and anyone who faces decisions requiring personal sacrifice for collective benefit. The answers cannot be found in regulations or procedures, but must be developed through individual reflection on personal values and their relationship to institutional obligations. Modern American military forces continue honoring the tradition established by Dustoff crews in Vietnam through medical evacuation operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other contemporary conflicts. Helicopter crews still risk their lives to evacuate wounded soldiers from hostile areas under dangerous conditions. They still make tactical decisions that exceed normal risk parameters when wounded soldiers require immediate assistance. Their success continues depending on technical proficiency, tactical skill, and moral commitment that enables ordinary individuals to accomplish extraordinary missions under impossible circumstances. The technology has improved significantly since Vietnam, but fundamental human factors remain unchanged. Individual soldiers still trust that help will come when needed, regardless of tactical circumstances or personal danger, to rescue crews. This trust represents the foundation of military effectiveness that transcends specific conflicts, political objectives, or technological capability. It connects soldiers across generations through shared understanding that military service requires individuals to risk everything for abstract principles that define national character and military professionalism. The helicopter rotors have long since stopped turning over landing zone echo. The radio frequencies that once carried desperate calls for medical evacuation now transmit different voices facing new challenges in distant conflict. But the principles that motivated Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks continue inspiring military personnel who understand that some obligations transcend personal survival and institutional procedures. His story reminds us that military effectiveness ultimately depends on individuals who choose conscience over convenience when faced with decisions that define their character and their contribution to collective security. Such choices cannot be mandated through regulations or inspired through training programs. They emerge from personal values that individuals bring to military service and develop through shared experiences with others who accept similar obligations. In an era when military conflicts increasingly involve complex political objectives and ambiguous moral parameters, the clarity of Wilbanks' decision provides reference point for evaluating contemporary military actions. He faced competing obligations: institutional obedience versus individual conscience, personal survival versus mission accomplishment, regulatory compliance versus moral commitment, and chose values that transcended immediate tactical considerations. His choice cost him his life, but preserved values that continue defining American military culture long after. These values cannot be measured through tactical success or strategic victory, but rather through willingness of individual soldiers to risk everything for principles that connect them to historical traditions and future obligations. The jungle has reclaimed landing zone echo, but memory preserves what happened there during one monsoon night when ordinary men chose extraordinary sacrifice for abstract principles that seemed worth dying for. Their story continues inspiring others who face similar decisions in different conflicts under different circumstances, but with the same fundamental choice between personal survival and collective obligation. Consider this. In a world where institutional loyalty often conflicts with individual conscience, where regulations sometimes seem inadequate for extraordinary circumstances, and where personal sacrifice for collective benefit appears increasingly rare, what lessons can we draw from Chief Warrant Officer Wilbanks' decision to risk everything for one wounded Marine he had never met? His story reminds us that some values transcend tactical calculations, political objectives, and institutional procedures. These values define military professionalism at its highest level and connect contemporary military forces to historical traditions that have shaped American national character through centuries of conflict and peace. If this reflection on courage, sacrifice, and moral decision-making under extreme circumstance has moved you to consider your own obligations to principles that transcend personal convenience, Please share this story with others who value individual responsibility for collective welfare. Subscribe to honor the memory of those who chose conscience over career, mission accomplishment over personal survival, and moral commitment over institutional procedures. Their sacrifice demands nothing less than our continued reflection on values that define not just military professionalism, but human character when faced with choices that reveal who we truly are when everything else has been stripped away. The jungle may have reclaimed their battlefield, but their example continues illuminating the path forward for anyone willing to risk something valuable for someone else's benefit.